Good morning. Sometimes we encounter Bible stories or lessons that we have heard so many times they can become a bit two-dimensional to us. The concept of the least being the greatest and Jesus coming to serve rather than to be served are some of the most well-known proverbs of Christian life. So one of my favorite things to do when I encounter a text like this in a book as ancient as the Bible is rediscover their humanity. Our gospel reading this morning provides us with an excellent opportunity to do this. For the many of you that are parents, I'm sure you've had the experience where one of your kids comes up to you and says something like, "Mom or Dad, I need to ask you something, but I need you to say yes." If you're not a parent yet, you can probably remember doing something like this as a kid. And this is exactly what happens in our gospel story today. James and John come up to Jesus, probably corner him a little bit, and they say, "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask of you." There is so much to unpack here. It's such a revealing question, isn't it? First off, they must not be very confident in their upcoming request because they felt the need to pre-secure their answer. And the audacity of these two guys to walk up to the living embodiment of the fullness of God and say, "We want you to do whatever we ask," is nothing short of hilarious. There is probably a full sermon to be had in this one line about humanity trying to bend God to their own will, but it's not the sermon you're hearing today. And then Jesus responds, no doubt sarcastically, "Well, what is it that you would like me to do for you?" James and John asked Jesus to sit by his side in glory, to be his right and his left-hand men in the kingdom of God. Now, their plan for this discreet request was obviously not executed very well because they were overheard by the other 10 disciples, and an argument inevitably ensues. So in response to all of this power jockeying, Jesus issues the famous teaching, "Whoever wishes to be great among you must be servant of all. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This last line is the key to understanding the story, but we're missing a bit of important context. See, the lectionary we use to guide us through biblical texts each year is an excellent tool, but it's not perfect, and this week it actually omits the first 3 verses of today's story. In these 3 verses, Mark 10:32 through 34, Jesus foretells to the disciples of his impending arrest, death, and resurrection in Jerusalem. Even more importantly, this is the 3rd time that Jesus tells them this in the last 2 chapters. In chapter 8, when Jesus says this, Peter infamously rebukes him, and he tells Peter to "Get behind me, Satan." And in chapter 9, when Jesus again foretells his death and resurrection, the scene immediately following is the disciples arguing on the road to Capernaum about which among them is the greatest. And now in chapter 10, Jesus foretells these things for a 3rd time, and immediately James and John approach him, seeking to affirm their status. In the Bible, when we see patterns or repetitions such as this one, which occurs 3 times in 2 chapters, it means the author wants to make sure we don't miss it. It's probably important. So 3 times Jesus spoke these things to the disciples, and 3 times they failed to listen. How could this be? Is Jesus just a bad teacher? Are the disciples incredibly dumb? Neither of these seem likely. Instead, it seems that their ability to understand him is being prevented by something. Their listening is impaired. The context of this story shows us that 2 things are stopping the disciples from listening: their expectations and their motivations. The expectations are a huge barrier to listening. We have thousands of them. Our brains, for the sake of survival and our sanity, have been trained over thousands of years to predict and to compartmentalize. Most of our expectations are incredibly simple things we never think about. When we swim underwater, we expect not to be able to breathe. When we toss the football, we expect it to arc downward toward the earth rather than travel on an infinite line up into space. When we see 2 and 2, we expect 4. This is how we grasp the world around us. And if we keep recalculating every time we had these experiences, we would never be able to learn and to grow. But expectations, especially the ones we don't realize are there, can be barriers for us as well. Ask anyone who does anti-racism work, and they will no doubt tell you that one of the most tiresome pieces of their job is helping people realize how many implicit biases they have and how deeply they affect the way we experience the world. These implicit biases are part of the same survival instincts that generate our other expectations. We have been trained, intentionally or otherwise, to see a certain type of person and expect a certain thing. Most of the time, we don't even realize that we do this. But when we engage in anti-racism work, we find ourselves continuing to uncover these implicit biases within ourselves and others so that we can attempt to counteract them or at least set them aside so we can see the world more honestly. This ability to recognize assumptions and even suspend them for a second is crucial if we want to be a vessel for new ideas. Scientists, the best ones, are very good at this. When Albert Einstein published his special theory of relativity in 1905, he reimagined the theory of gravity. Gravity is about as predictable as things come, right? Apple goes up, apple comes down, or at least so says Newton. And Newton's theory of gravity, that big things pull smaller things, had dominated physics for hundreds of years by the time when Einstein came and changed the entire game. Einstein was able to entertain the possibility of imagining a new way of seeing something as fundamental to existence as gravity. And if he hadn't done this, he would have gotten nowhere. He would have been stuck trying to use new math on outdated equations, something akin to putting new wine in old wineskins. For the disciples in our story today, the greatest expectation that they were surely battling was the expectation of the Messiah. In Jewish culture, the Messiah was not expected to be a servant, but a king. For hundreds of years, the Jewish people had been conquered, oppressed, and ruled over by empire after empire. The Babylonians, the Persians, Greeks, and Romans came one after another. And to the Jewish mind, the Messiah was supposed to be a military leader, one who would lead the Israelite forces against the powers of their oppressors and defeat them in battle, renewing the Jewish independence and their claim to their holy and promised land. This Messiah is often linked to King David, a powerful warrior and righteous ruler. But Jesus wasn't talking about going into battle. Jesus was talking about being beaten, literally and figuratively. To the disciples, the concept of a Messiah who dies was oxymoronic. It just didn't make any sense to them. So we see Jesus trying 3 times to get his point across. But it was important. Not only because it's important for them to understand who he is, but also because he knows that in their ministry, when they go out, they're going to encounter the same set of expectations in every Jewish person that they try to minister to and to spread the good news. And who they think Jesus is also probably affects their motivations for being there. See, motivations are something that Jesus values very highly. This is focused on in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus says things like, "If you so much look at a woman with lust in your eyes, you have already committed adultery." He also says, when you pray, don't pray loudly in the streets like the hypocrites, but instead pray quietly, alone in your room. He also says, when you give money to the temple, don't do it with a show for everyone to see, but do it secretly, so it is between you and God. Jesus cares about the motivation behind an action. Even doing a good thing, such as giving to the church or praying to God, can be tainted by impure motivations. And we see this play out all the time in the world around us, probably in our own actions as well. A politician might use benevolence to cover or distract from a scandal. We may be extra nice to that coworker because we want our boss to see us as a team player. We may make a charitable donation because we really just need a tax write-off. And in our gospel story about James and John today, remembering its precursor of the disciples arguing in chapter 9 about who's the greatest, this calls into question the disciples' very motivation for being with Jesus. So when Jesus lectures them about the greatest being a servant, he's really asking, why are you here? Why are you following me? It can be easy to hitch your wagon to the Messiah because of all the places that he might take you. But it's not enough for Jesus that they be there. He needs them there for the right reasons. So when Jesus says the greatest of all must first be servant of all, he is reminding the disciples and us as modern readers that the call to follow Christ is a call to be selfless rather than self-centered. Easier said than done. The United States especially seems to be struggling with this concept. We have a massive wealth disparity in our nation, having economically and culturally created a class of 1%ers who care exclusively about making themselves more money, no matter the cost. And we have billionaires taking joyrides into outer space while their employees can't afford the month's rent. But our self-centeredness doesn't stop at the top. The U.S. continues to lag behind other wealthy nations as our handling of the COVID pandemic. We can't, for some reason, as a collective society, agree to wear a mask over our face to protect others. We can't seem to cross crucial vaccination thresholds to protect our most vulnerable citizens. And we are caught in a war between those who seek exclusively to expand their own individual freedom and those who see liberty as a communal endeavor. As I mentioned in the children's sermon, to listen well, we must be able to set our own desires aside for a while. Otherwise, it's impossible. If we want to be a people who is continually listening to the voice of God, we must remember this. And listening to God can be a difficult thing to grasp. In the movies or on TV, whenever someone wants direction from God or the universe, they're often looking for a sign. And this has never really worked for me. I also know people who have experienced God speaking to them in an audible voice. And while I've tried to hear this voice on many occasions, this has never worked for me either. I know there have been times in my own life when I desperately wanted to hear some sort of guidance from the divine, but deep down, I knew what I really wanted to hear. It's as if I was saying, God, I have something to ask you, but I need you to say yes. Whether I was looking for a sign or waiting for a voice, it didn't matter, because I clearly wasn't ready to listen. Now, I don't think the voice of God comes in any singular form. I can believe it can be heard in both the loudest claps of thunder and in the tiniest tug on your heart, but only if we are truly ready to listen. My hope for us, both as the community of St. Andrew and as a collection of individual followers of Christ, is that we listen well. May we continually recognize our expectations and check our motivations so that we can be fully in tune with the work of God in every facet of our world and lives. Amen.